All right, welcome everybody to the first edition of the Vault.js Leaders in Privacy series. I am very happy to have everybody here today, and in particular, I am happy to welcome Meszaros from FLLR Consulting as our first guest today, who's going to be sharing a bunch of insights about the world of consent and preferences and his very extensive experience, both implementing these on the vendor side, working on the consulting side, and having literally experienced, dozens and dozens and dozens of these different implementations with clients. He's going to be sharing some of the best practices around things that have worked, things that don't work, and some of the common pitfalls that are out there. So before joining Fuller as an account director, Zach spent about 6 years with OneTrust, I think. And so as part of that, had an opportunity to work with a lot of enterprises doing getting a sort of unique perspective on things from the vendor perspective, but then crossed over to the consulting side and now has an even broader aperture of sort of what's going on from consent and helping clients meet the ever-changing regulatory environment as it relates to that. So, welcome, Zach. Thank you for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh, and thank you for the introduction. Excited to be here.
So to kick things off, and just so everybody has sort of a sense of sort of format and structure here, I want to just kind of really kind of pick Zach's brain on some of the experiences that he's having, what he's seen in the marketplace. But to kind of kick things off, I really would love to just kind of get your thoughts on like the the major trends that you're seeing, right? Things are happening so fast in this space with regulatory actions, with changing laws, with all of these different lawsuits that organizations are being hit with. Give me your sort of lay of the land of like what is it that you when clients come to you and say, "Catch me up." What is it that I need to be worried about? What are the handful of points that you're kind of taking them through?
Yeah. I'd say that there's really three primary areas that I talk to clients about as far as like what's driving the change and the shift in the marketplace. And that's going to be, obviously, you brought it up, the changing of laws, the expansion of regulatory bodies. I think we're seeing even the consortium of regulators come together. And so here in the US, major shift and emphasis on making sure that organizations are actually following the letter of the law, putting more emphasis onto that. And then that's being paired with technology changes from a browser level. So whether that's thinking about Google and some of the bigger vendors where we're having to read off of GPC signals, or even thinking about Chrome or maybe something like Firefox, where there's now modes that folks can run without letting any third-party cookies. And so, those two changing aspects of the marketplace are changing the way that folks are using cookies, are using tags. And I think there's a lot more attention around, right now internally, vendors that are being onboarded, tags that we're going to be putting on the sites. Mobile applications this year has been like a really strong one for me. And so, I think a long time we talk about the web when it talks to these tracking technologies, but it also matters on phones and mobile applications. And so those things really coming into scope, and making sure that this is a holistic approach that accounts for a customer their entire journey, right? And so when they're in an unauthenticated state and they're coming to a website and all those things that we're used to dealing with, I think we're seeing a lot of customers now also, well, think about what about my known customers that I'm tracking across multiple devices and potentially TVs and iPads and all these different things, and how do we support a data subject like that? And so while people are still kind of trying to get the basics down, there's also kind of a contingent that's really moving forward into an authenticated consent and a more privacy focused world.
No, that totally makes sense. When I think about this, I kind of think of it as this framework of you've got the penalties are getting bigger, right? They could come from the regulators, this
Yeah.
consortium of regulators that you're talking about. It could come from some plaintiff's attorney, right? Who I'm getting one of these hundreds of lawsuits, or maybe I've got multiple of them for VPPA, CIPA,
We're seeing a
consent
ton of
related
those.
class actions. There's a lot of stuff that's out there. But to me, this seems like it puts the pressure back on the organization to get the basics of consent right. And I'm curious what you're seeing out there in the world of like a lot of most people that I interact with have already got a consent management system and got one a long time ago.
Yep.
But most of those are not operating completely accurately. So
No.
maybe kind of
No.
talk
Yeah.
about like build it for us from the basics up of like what happens to those systems over time and why are there challenges? Why are people re-implementing? Why are they changing vendors? Why are they doing all this stuff when you would think, right? Like if I was not thinking about it technically at all, I would think all we need to do is pop up a little box and ask people, do you consent or not?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you hit the nail on the head there with if the basics have to be done and they have to be done really well. And there's a couple different scenarios that I've seen over the past year where you're 100% right. Everybody's got a CMP in some sort of fashion that they stood up. There's a couple like buckets that I put people into right now when we're interacting with them. We have a lot of folks that I think thought exactly what you just said, Josh. This is a box that I just throw up and then I'm going to forget about it for the next, 3 or 4 years. It's still going to be running and everything's going to be fine. I would say that's probably the most common instance of someone's coming to us and they actually want to expand into authenticated consent or, collecting, different types of consent or maybe moving on to their mobile apps. And before we can ever start doing any of that, we need to make sure that, hey, is your CMP running on your website all right? And when you start asking questions, some of the big red flags for me will often be, are you guys running scans regularly? Have you guys actually done a manual audit and gone through and not just relied on scans, but taken a look and poked around yourself and tried to find gaps? Who's actually owning and promoting new versions and keeping up with regulatory changes and language, changing the templates? And it's not even an exaggeration to say that probably about in half those circumstances, we have folks that they haven't even updated for CPRA. They still are just using a CCPA template. And so that setting that baseline and understanding all the tracking technologies that have come onto your website in the last 5 years since you threw that banner up is a massive lift. And there's been tons of changes, right? Marketing has been doing things, digital's been doing things, the data team. And so if you're not actively managing this day to day, there's just so much tech debt when you come into these projects where you need to figure out what are all the tracking technologies doing. And a lot of times it's hard to find the person in the organization that can tell you that.
Well, you had a slide up earlier that kind of
Mhm.
flashed through it, I think, as you were getting to what was relevant for us called the challenge, and it had three boxes on it. And you were the question I had about it was it said things like, like, okay, there's new tags added to the site or there's new vendors.
Yeah.
But to me, it seems like these are spot on. But also what it's kind of exposing is that a lot of clients don't have the right controls in place for these things. So that, for example, the team that runs the consent management tool never learns about the fact that a new tag was implemented, or perhaps learns about it from one of those plaintiffs' attorneys or something.
It's the worst case, but yeah, we do see that. And you're exactly right. Eh, eh, you know, Privacy teams, I think, unfortunately, a lot of times operate in a bit of a silo, and folks don't want to go through privacy unless they have to. And so, what we've really seen is there's no governance or standard operating procedure widely around the industry for these items, and because of that, it causes a technical drift or a compliance drift over time with folks' consent management platforms, where every single time one of these actions happens and the privacy team isn't involved, and there's not some sort of stated process that every time marketing is adding a new vendor or the digital team's adding a new tag to the site, that they don't go through and use the scanning tool, classify this correctly, and make sure it's tied into their CMP. Every single time that happens, you just get farther and farther away from being in compliance. And a lot of the market, I don't think when they stood this up in the US understood that this needed to be an active process. And I think that there was a thought that the CMP tools that they were buying would kind of do all of this for them in an automated sense. And frankly, that's not true. I mean, even with the best tooling in the world, there's always going to be a human element and a governance process around it.
Totally. Totally. Well, and one of the, I mean, this was sort of sparked a little bit by one of the questions that came in, but also you're talking about the evolution of these things, right? Like since the Sephora ruling in California, sort of one of the original, sort of consent related regulatory actions that was taken, there's been this sort of scrambling or mandate to respect global privacy control or GPC headers. And that, is something that I think a lot of people back to the idea of it being a pop-up, right? That should be automatic. But I think that when you sort of peel back the onion a little bit, and maybe you can sort of talk about like some of the cases where you have customers who where or you're coming in to do an implementation, right? And or clean up an implementation where those things aren't being respected. And it's not a case of their consent management tool not working. It's all these other corner cases like,
Yeah.
technology not being implemented, through the tag management system or not being integrated or, firing before the consent management tool has their exceptions. Can you kind of talk us through some of those like gotchas that people need to look out for in terms of like why they might have a perfectly operating consent management tool, but be completely non-compliant with GPC headers?
Sure. Yeah. So I I'm not going to name any names, and I but over this past year, it was while I was still with OneTrust. I met with a client, and um, this client thought they were respecting GPC. They had the CMP up on their site. Um, and I think you even called it out in the question, though, like what had they done wrong is they hadn't actually connected the CMP to their tag manager. And so they were not actually doing anything. They were not stopping scripts from firing across over around 100 websites. And they'd had this up for years thinking they were blocking these items,
Right.
which
We
is
call that the air guitar implementation.
right, which is something that a scanner like Vault can help figure out. Like, oh, we've got an air guitar implementation going on. It is a shocking amount of times, though, Josh, that we see that and we come across it. And I would say more common than folks completely being unblocked, like they didn't do the tag manager integration. That's pretty rare. And that was like some folks that clearly had a bit of a misunderstanding of what they were purchasing and the process. But really commonly is folks take care of the CMP, but they don't actually know or they don't understand that there's always a subset of tracking technologies that aren't being managed out of Google Tag Manager. I mean, or whatever Launch or whatever you're using. And as best as you can try to, there's just going to be scripts and there's going to be certain things that don't do that. So YouTube is a great example. Or any other kind of content, embedded content, right? So if you're using Vimeo or any sort of third-party system on your website to host that content, you're putting that directly on the page. And there's a good chance in that script that you're putting directly on the page, they're dropping pixels and they are collecting information. They're sending that information back to aggregate audiences and analytics and all these different items. And so when someone sends a GPC signal down, you have to make a determination. Well, should I be shutting off those page specific scripts as well? And that's where a lot of times the answer is yes. And to take it even a step further with that, we have a subset of customers, and we see a subset of customers that if they see a GPC signal and someone's authenticated, they know who that person is. So they know that I'm on Vault.js's website and I'm logged in at zackmeszaros.com. Then they think that GPC signal needs to be appended to that person's profile. And it actually kind of triggers like a do not sell, do not share request as well. So it doesn't just affect the items that are on the website or on the mobile application, but even starts to affect some of the back-end analytics and targeting and what you're allowed to do with an individual's data. And so that's where, along that spectrum of GPC implementations, I think you have to decide like where do we want to land and where do we feel like we're safe. It definitely got to get past blocking all the tracking technologies to a bare minimum.
How when you think about that and that's I mean you raised a great point, right? So like the idea of I'm logged in, on the mobile app. I come to the website. Maybe I'm logged in with a GPC header. I need to update that now across my entire profile. That gets even more complicated when you think about unauthenticated, transitioning to authenticated in some of those environments. Maybe I wasn't initially logged in when I came to the website, but then I wanted to watch a piece of premium content or something, and I logged in and
Yep.
authenticated. How do you how when clients are asking you and they're saying, "Hey, I'm starting at a place of maybe a broken old implementation, but I want to get to the point where I'm doing these sort of advanced use cases that you're talking about. Like, how do I crawl, walk, run in that
Yeah.
process so that it's not because I'm not going to get budget for $1 million,
Yeah.
you know, CDP
So
project to manage this profile and live updates on every touch point.
exactly. The first item, Josh, and I know I'm on a Vault.js webinar. I'm not just saying, I mean, regardless, like the first thing is getting an understanding of what tracking technologies that are on the sites. And so whether that's using Vault.js, it's using another scanner, and there's going to be manual discovery here too, right? You've got to go through and you've got to talk to your teams. What are they actually using? And then from there, actually deciding and categorizing those tracking technologies and putting up a basic CMP banner that works in an unauthenticated state that's just living off of that cookie we drop on the browser. That's the baseline, and that's step one. And so that's regardless of what we want to do next, we've got to get that in place, and we've got to get that muscle built out where we know how to turn off the tracking technologies, and we can tell folks, analytics are turned off, marketing's turned off, and we can do each of those items. Because once we have that muscle built out of being able to do that, it's kind of the advanced parts become the easy parts, right, Josh? Like it's not that hard then to stitch an ID together or to pass an ID together. What's really hard is to make sure that, we're always like firing off the muscles that are actually turning off the tracking technologies and those items in the back end.
No, that makes total sense. And as you were saying that, it sort of triggered another common question or challenge that I think a lot of people are struggling with, which is it's easy to figure out, what technologies and what cookies I have on my unauthenticated homepage. But when I start talking about,
Logged in.
like, I know some of the examples you have, I start talking about I've got a third-party e-commerce site. Maybe they're not
Yeah.
controlled by me. I've got a logged in experience. Maybe I'm a healthcare company or a financial services company, and that's a really important experience for me, but that's really difficult for me to get a scanner to
Scans.
work in. A lot of the CMP scanners won't operate in those worlds. Maybe I have a bunch of single page apps that are, highly integrated with this. And I'm totally ignoring mobile for now, which is an even harder technical challenge than those. But like, um, how do I even assess the risk that I'm under if I can't get a baseline on all of those things? Or how do you kind of approach that with clients of trying to at least get, some kind of litmus test going of like, okay, what is happening behind the login? What is happening in this sign up process or this single page app?
Yeah. So Josh, I think that they broadly break down into two different use cases for me. It breaks down into kind of a B2C and a B2B use case, and it's not that direct, but like that's just kind of the buckets that I'll throw them into. And so when I say B2B use case there, let's think about us all using OneTrust, right? Or like our CMP provider.
Yep.
Um, you don't often get a CMP experience when you log into a site like that. And when you're using some sort of like business-based SaaS application. And the reason that I see that experience a lot of times is because in the terms and conditions, signing up, buying the product, right? You're making agreements and there's consents that are being had there. And I generally don't see folks making a jump or a rush in those scenarios. I think the scenarios that you're talking about and where we do see it is something like Chewy.com or a subscription based ordering website that folks are on, or social media sites are really good
Sure.
examples of this. And so with that, we're actually doing a big implementation right now for like a gaming kind of hardware software company, and with that, the baseline for them still needs to be the unauthenticated items and being able to execute on all of those. And then the main point to kind of move on from there is having a persistent identifier across all of their programs that they run. And this actually becomes probably the biggest blocker for folks, is that, like I said, they've got, Shopify running their store. They've got maybe a social media aspect that they've built out themselves. And then their marketing program is run by Salesforce, and they're all using different IDs. They don't have that CDP in place. They can't identify someone across all of that. And that becomes a blocker in these projects. And so, outside of OneTrust, outside of privacy tooling, we do need to be able to know who an individual is across the whole organization. And once that challenge is unlocked, once we do know who that individual is across the entire org, that shift to then assigning things to a known identifier versus just a random ID or an unauthenticated ID, that's going to happen on the login process. And whenever folks sign in, we're going to then call back the status of that individual's consent so that it follows them around on all their devices. This isn't something that's like super explicitly called out in any of the regs but there are folks that interpret the CPRA to say that if an opt-out needs to persist as far as they can identify a user, and that's really where we see that from a privacy side. Honestly, it's more experiential, right? This is where I'm seeing the marketing teams get involved. I'm seeing lots of folks from digital and customer experience, and they really care about, how a user experiences this, what's the brand perception. And I think that's the biggest win with this, Josh, is like you go to chewy.com and you feel like they're taking care of your data. You're logged in, they've got all your settings there, no matter where you come in and you log in from. And I think that's the big win and where we see folks pivoting to that.
Totally. Totally. When people are thinking about this risk, right, or this process, right, like what would be like, well, I'll give you sort of a slightly random question here, but like a lot of the chief privacy officers I know come from a legal background as opposed to say like a technical
Yeah,
background,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So, they're usually not as excited to engage in a conversation about HTTP requests and what type of cookie and what the query string parameters were on this particular vendor's data collection approach, right? But what would be you're riding a 20-story elevator ride with a chief privacy officer who's struggling with some of these concepts. What would be that advice that you deliver in those 20 floors?
That is a good question. That is a little bit. I think I'd have to ask them. I'm assuming, let's say this is a CMP focused talk. I think the main thing I would ask is like, what's their day-to-day role look like in the governance of the tracking technologies on their site, and then based off of that answer, would probably kind of want to jump into it, because I think the answer you're going to get more times than not, Josh, is going to be, I have absolutely no involvement in that, and that's a call out for me immediately to be talking a governance talk track. Hey, we need to put something in place where you are actually signing off, or probably not actually going to be the top person, but somebody on the privacy team is going to need to do a collaborative effort, make sure that we're categorizing these items, making sure that the marketing team has that governance in place. And that's the situation that I think I would assume most of them are in, and I would go with broadly. Now, if they say, well, I'm actually really involved in that, and I'm struggling to get alignment between my different teams, and the legal teams and the privacy teams that I do see more involved in this process, it's often because they've got a number of digital agencies actually running the websites. So it's not an it's not an in-house team that they trust and they've kind of given the keys, but it's like a couple different teams that can actually put vendor tracking technologies on the website. And at that point, I honestly generally will make a recommendation that they need to put some sort of technology in place. And that is generally going to be from two sides. Whenever folks are using a agency-based approach to putting new tracking technologies and tags on their website, my best practice and like my advice from a CMP side is that I would like to see some sort of more like auto blocking or allow list style implementation. So thinking about OneTrust auto blocking solution or source pointer Dodomi's like block list or allow list, things like that, where the privacy team and the privacy officer can have their scans. They can add, and then they can say anything that I've put in this list is good to go. If agencies try to put something else on the website's going to block it automatically. Now, there's other problems there too, right? Like that becomes a bigger list on the CMP. It's not going to be as effective as a manual implementation. And a lot
Yeah.
of times, those companies are the companies that, of course, really care about that. And so then, that process is kind of going to go against their business objectives. But that leaves them in a big risk if they don't have that in place. And so if they're unable to do that because it's really going to impact their site and they're really focused on that, that's where they need a good back end scanning tool to be notifying them when there's new tracking technologies on the site, when there's items that they haven't seen before. And it's not something that has to happen every day. It's just something that they should be checking in on, and it should be part of their regular, operating cadence, whether that's every other week or is on a monthly basis. And I know I'm saying, especially in the case with digital agencies, but I mean, even if you have internal teams doing it, you don't know what they're doing. It's really hard to just give them the keys. And ultimately, like, it is our responsibility on the privacy team, regardless of what they do. So,
Well, it sounds like, and I'm curious because we're seeing this trend in our customers. I'm seeing how much you guys see this across your customer base as well. As we're seeing a trend towards wanting to have more structure and documentation around the controls,
yes.
specifically as it relates to digital tracking technologies, right? So, like being able to, I'll pick on something really, really simple, right? Which everyone would say, "Oh, we have that," but do you, right? Is sort of the question is like, and you've mentioned vendors. Do you have an approved vendor list that, like, if a regulator asks you, to produce, could you show that you update it once a month or, one
Yeah.
every other week or whatever cadence is your policy, and that actually lists all your vendors on it, right? Like that, those type of, we've seen a large push to say, well, we want to start creating that evidence, but also having that structure so that when my scanner picks up something, obviously we're biased, a lot of Vault JS in that example, but when Vault identifies something, I want to be able to go back to that list and talk to who, whether it was an agency, whether it was an internal team, whether it was an international team, and say, this is not on the list. I update my approvals of who's on that allow list that you were talking about every 30 days. And you're
Yep.
not on the list. So here's the process that you get on the list.
Exactly. Uh, and this sounds really simple. Like, it sounds like common
Yeah.
sense that we're talking about a bit here, but it's astounding, Josh. At
Yeah.
70% more of the companies that we come into, there's no documented process. Like, there's no written SOP, there's no standard. There's honestly not even there's not even talking or thought of what the
Yeah.
process should be around this stuff. And so the biggest gap when I see to that is the legal and product alignment. I don't know how your conversations go when you sometimes get on with some of those teams, but to me, it's like they're completely different worlds, completely kind of operating not with different goals, but they have really different outcomes that they're trying to drive. And so trying to even get folks to align on, are we using this for marketing or is this analytics, right? It can be a really hard discussion, and it can be really difficult. And so multiplying that out across hundreds of tracking technologies on the site, it's an intense process. And legal and product, in my opinion, they need to be meeting at least once a month, if not more. And there needs to be someone on the privacy team that does start to, and I'm sure you're seeing this some, Josh, where maybe it's not the chief privacy officer, but there is some counsel or there's an analyst or someone that actually has a really good understanding in a good program of what the tracking technologies are. And for me, that's one of the signs that, oh, this is a advanced team and we're going to be able to actually execute here, is like that kind of hybrid role existing.
Yeah. No, that is totally true because I think there's such a challenge for organizations where they have to manage the legal requirements of what all of the laws and defending themselves from these suits, and then the technical side, and then
Yeah.
also there's a whole business justification for why all these technologies are there that we have to remain true to. Otherwise the easiest approach would be to just either shut down the website or take off all the technology, do no marketing, right? Like if they didn't create a lot of value, there wouldn't be a lot of anxiety around it, right? And so that is walking in those worlds. I mean, honestly, this is one of the things that we encounter a lot is that our clients, and when we're talking with people, they frequently have staff in one area or another. Like if you think of those sort of three worlds, right? Like you've got the legal, you've got the technical, and then maybe you've got like the marketing or the business side. And so the ability to walk in those worlds is challenging, and the people that have those skills are in high demand. So
Yeah.
I would imagine that's fueling a lot of the growth at Fuller since you guys help bridge that gap in the middle.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And there's a place for us to come in and do that work and to provide a managed service, but there's also I think a growth of like native resources for these teams where we're seeing like, hey, this isn't something where as much as a consultant would, I'd love for you guys to pay me to be on board all the time. I mean, these people are going to have to do this 365 days a year for the future. And as we're implementing these, I always like to remind people we're not implementing a project. We're implementing a program that it needs love and care once we're gone.
Yeah,
And that's where good scanning tools, good processes, good governance, good CMP tools as well. They all make that process easier. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a halftime resource, right? There's got to be some amount of hours we dedicate to this to pay attention to it.
totally. Well, I know one of the promises we made to folks when
Sure.
they joined the call was that you would talk through a few different real world case study examples. And
Yeah.
I feel like, and I don't want to be guilty of this, and I probably have been guilty of this for the last 30 minutes, which is, get excited about the conversation, get excited about asking my questions, right? But I also feel like a big opportunity here is to make this more tangible, put this into the
Yeah.
real context of a customer. Talk us through sort of like, a couple of these examples and like what were they struggling with? What was the situation? Try to help the attendees, kind of relate to that situation. And I'll also just broadly say to everybody listening, please send any of your questions into the Q&A tab. We will get to them at the end, or worst case, we'll follow up post webinar and answer all of them. So please don't be shy on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. And Josh, also don't be shy as we go through this. If you've got any questions, any thoughts, please let me know and ask. So our first case study here, um, calling it incomplete and inconsistent compliance. So this is a customer that we dealt with this year, that they have currently deployed a CMP across all of their primary domains. So they manage all of their content-based domains, their marketing domains is probably the best way to put that internally. This is a national food distribution, so as you're thinking like retail, food, snacks, things like that. But they don't run their own Magento and their Shopify sites themselves. And so
Right.
for the past couple of years, they've had inconsistent compliance and inconsistent experience because some of those Shopify sites and some of those Magento sites, the Shopify ones in particular, because they're really just doing the store function out of that, it would be mydomain.com that you would be on, and then you would wind up on store.mydomain.com, which was then actually hosted by Shopify. And suddenly in that experience, a user went from they got greeted by a banner. They said they didn't want tracking technologies. So they moved over into the shop and there's no CMP deployed on the shop and they're suddenly being tracked. And so I don't think, I think everyone here, there's regulatory risks here. If a consumer figured out that was what's going on, a consumer could be very upset about that.
Yeah.
And so really inconsistent experience that these
I,
folks were delivering across brands. Yeah.
No, I was going to say this is such a key point because I see this when we're onboarding new customers or even having, preliminary conversations with prospects, right? Like we see this obviously in the e-commerce example that you're giving, but also inside, you know, support sites that are run by third-party technologies, HR portals that are run by third parties,
HR is
investor
always
relations.
missed, Josh. That's always
I mean,
missed.
all of these areas are like almost guaranteed non-compliance when you
Yep.
start scanning them.
Yeah. um, And this falls right in that pattern. And right. So I mean, this isn't a huge project or a huge thing for us. We just need to come in and deploy the OneTrust CMP across a couple of these different domains. The bigger thing is going to be the governance process that needs to get implemented after this. Because just because we're putting the OneTrust CMP across these sites doesn't mean that they're going to go ahead and they're going to be managed, long term. And they're not taking over the site. So getting those third party teams, getting those digital agencies to be a part of that process and to figure that out. Now, with that, I'm sorry, Parm, I don't, can you go back to thank you. With that, really I would say the catalyst for this, Josh, was actually, they went through and they had a third party team do scans and audits for them. And what they got back, they did not like. They were like, holy cow, like we didn't realize that our shops, that our Magentos were running this much. And so for them, it was really just getting to a baseline and consistently across everything. And right now, for them, that's focused on just CMP. But as we go to this next slide here, I do have some examples up of another client, Lilly Pulitzer, because this is ultimately the end goal of that customer, is to get to this same state where Lilly Pulitzer's at with their tools, which is they've got everything for consent, communication consent and opt-out, as well as consumer access requests, all done separately. So they don't have that big CDP project. They don't have that joint identifier over the top, Josh. But for a retail brand like this, that's perfect, right? They're covering off on all their basis. If you look at the next screen here too, Parm, and click one more, right? They're popping up their cookie banner. They've got their opt-out forms linked here. They feel very compliant. And so this is kind of the goal that client that I was talking about with all those challenges, this is who they want to be. They want to morph into this Lilly Pulitzer example of separate but strong and compliant, right? We don't need to have our consumer access requests like super tied into our preference centers. We don't need to be that experiential. They're not seeing enforcement about that level of things, but across the board, really standard and strong baseline to mitigate risk. And so that's kind of the goal that we see for a lot of these folks that are in that state, Josh, where they're not quite there, not quite compliant across everything. Don't think too big, right? Like we don't need to do authenticated consent. We don't need to go crazy right now. What we need to do is get to this Lilly Pulitzer level of we've got all our components and they're all running strong and we keep them up to date.
That totally makes sense.
Yep. All right.
So when you think about a client like obviously Lilly was sort of the end state that you're shooting for,
Sure.
but for the one that you were first describing, what expectations should I have if I'm a chief privacy officer and I'm lobbying for this internally and I'm saying I need to go secure budget, I need to set expectations around timeline. Like what obviously every case is going to be different. It's all going to be, there's all the consultant caveats, but like is this something that I can accomplish for $10,000? Is this something I should be budgeting $100,000? Is this something I should be budgeting $1 million for? Right? And is that something I can get done in 4 weeks or 6 months
Yeah.
or a year? Help me frame that so that I'm not starting with a totally unrealistic set of expectations, right? I don't want to go talk to my CFO and tell him it's going to be 2 weeks and 10 grand if it turns out to be $1 million in a year. Right.
Yeah, no, completely. So I'm not going to talk about software costs when I'm considering this because that's an area where you already have a CMP. So it's just going to be that same software licensing that we're using for that because that's kind of a separate bucket of costs.
Sure.
This is something that we measure in weeks, not months. So coming in and and that's just generally for deploying CMPs onto websites in general. I've done probably hundreds of websites and we've got like 40 people on our team and almost all of them have been doing OneTrust CMPs for 5+ years. So we go pretty fast with it, right? Like we have a lot of experience with it. You're looking at somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks or like, maybe on the shorter end, like 5 to 6 if it's really dialed in and there's not a ton of complexity with like client-side script wrapping and testing and things like that. And you're looking in the middle range of what you send from the 10 to 100. So if you have 3 websites, you're probably looking from like depending on who your consultant is, anywhere from like 30 to 60, depending, and also depending on what aspects you're going to own.
Yeah.
So we, have clients that they've got great and talented tag manager people, and they've got great web developers. And so all they really need from us is to come in and do some OneTrust work. And that looks a lot different than folks that don't have tag manager people. And so, I'm bringing a web developer to the project and a tag manager to, someone to actually do the Google Tag Manager work to the project as well. And in some circumstances, then we take over those roles as a part of the governance process then full time as well, right? And so we kind of leave that tag manager person in place with a set of SLAs that says, hey, anytime you add a new vendor, add new tags, you send us a ticket and we'll take care of it. And so it depends.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I'm a CPO, 6 to 8 weeks, I mean,
Yeah.
ballpark, this is
Yep.
something that realistically, if I was starting 2026 and I was feeling pressure, I was receiving lawsuits, and
Get it
I,
done in
I was
Q1
being told I
easily.
need to get this straightened up, this would be a realistic Q1 goal that by the end of Q1 I could potentially have made some real progress in moving down that continuum of sort of sophistication.
Absolutely. I would say that within quarter for these items is very normal. And again, yeah, it's always measured in weeks, not months with this. I think when you start to talk about more complex use cases, so
Sure.
some of the case studies, if we're talking about authenticated consent and then bringing in marketing purposes and downstream systems, that's where I think you start to see those timelines draw out.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue. So let's so let's talk about those situations.
Yeah, so I don't actually think that this one is fully mature yet. Parm, do you mind kind of listing out all the items here for me so we can thank you? So
Looks like this one's starting to struggle with some of the mobile stuff.
they are also struggling a bit with some differences between tool sets, right? So they moved from Osano CMP to OneTrust CMP. Need us to come in and kind of stabilize and optimize the new platform. They're not very comfortable with OneTrust yet. Obviously, they just got that. There's different nomenclature, and we see this a lot when people are switching vendors. There's the we need this done immediately timeline because like our contract's ending over here, and so what happened for them is they did a fast and furious rollout of OneTrust. They actually didn't do it with us. They did it and not with OneTrust, or they did it themselves, which is always a red flag for me. And this is an international brand that has, even on the same domains or within the same mobile application, they have a federalized product team and model where there's a core team that builds functionality, and then there's subset teams from different brands and regions that use some of that federalized technology that's being built to actually host their applications and their websites. And so you can imagine that's a complex environment. And then there's multiple teams that are like deploying CMP scripts and things like that. And so right now we're in a weird, you see the OneTrust script fire multiple times as a user, as if in a natural journey where you're going from across their website, but you potentially wind up in different product areas that different product teams own. You wind up with like hitting another consent banner and then having multiple consent values stored. And then on their mobile application, depending on what region you're coming from, sometimes they're using a CMP. Sometimes they have a home built mechanism that's trying to be a CMP. And I mean, there's a ton of concerns here for me, right? I mean, Josh, I mean, as well as anyone, if you want to do IAB stuff, you've got to be a certified IAB CMP. So I never love folks like trying to build their own CMPs just because, like, what are you going to do? You're going to go certify that. Like, it's not a good use of your time.
Challenging to be able to support like the ever changing standards, right? Like how are you gonna your system now has to support a GPP string, which is pretty
Yep.
complicated, and you need to be able to, generate these things dynamically based on the different conditions that you might be under, and it's yeah that
It's a lot.
we see the same thing. I will say, I mean, there are some enterprises at sufficient scale that can be successful with this, but for
Yeah.
the average person, I don't, you have to be willing to make a significant investment in your technology platform and maintain it It's not a one-time build of we're going to slap up a banner and, call it quits. Because the world is just changing too fast in terms of like the requirements, the standards, and all the different things that are expected to be supported. So yeah, totally agree with that. I also thought this was interesting because we get involved frequently
Migrations.
on these fast migrations, right? Like I feel like there's a lot of it's a pretty common scenario for us in a fire drill situation, which can be this contract is done. It can also be sometimes triggered by some sort of external impetus, like a lawsuit or something, where it's like, oh my God, I need a scan of all my properties immediately, and I need to find out how much of this is true, how much of this is not true. And sometimes that needs to be done under privilege and blah blah blah. But yeah, this definitely rang true with me. So how did you address this? This sounds like a real, sort of
So
tangle of yarn that
it
needs to be
is. Yeah,
unwound.
and so this is one where the end goal for them is to have this authenticated state, and for them, this is a big multi-brand enterprise, and so they see themselves as similar to the NFL.
Okay.
They see themselves as the NFL, and they see all of their little brands as all the NFL teams. And so they would like to get to this world here where they've got their top level settings, both privacy and communication settings, then sitting over top of their brand level settings. And so if I come in and I go to one of their brand level websites, I only interact with the brand level settings. But if I go and I interact with the top level organization, I can see all of the different brands I've interacted with and control all of my settings for everything all at one place. To get to this point, not very easy for them. To be transparent, our recommendations and the process that we're in right now with them is a long and drawn out audit and architecture procedure. They've got over 100 different domains. They have lots of different technical debt and technical issues going on. And Josh, that's not even talking about some of the core themes that we talked about at the beginning, which is like just gaps in blocking.
Yeah.
Because if and it's not necessarily a sign that's always going to be there, but if you've got folks that you're seeing scripts fire multiple times, different sets of tags, there's a good chance then you're also not. And so on the backside, right, all that. And so right now we're going through, and even though their end goal is to get to where the NFL is, we're actually just doing the basics right now. And we're going back through and across all of those domains, producing reports on what's wrong, why are the scripts firing multiple times, where are all the unblocked pieces of tracking technologies, and we're really making the case at a top level, C-level, that they need to make an investment into a cohesive set of tracking technologies and that they need to force their teams to do it. Because right now, essentially where we're at, just to give you some insight into it, is the product teams don't want to do this. The product teams are
They're
pushing
resistant
very,
to it, right?
which is always, I mean, this isn't the first time I've seen this, and it won't be the last. But that, and so that's where we're at, right? And I think that the way the privacy and the marketing team sees things and sees the world is that they're never going to be able to do authenticated consent, and they're never going to have preference centers that look like the NFL's if their product teams won't align and just use the same technology underneath.
Yeah.
And so right now, I mean, we are at not an uncommon spot for a consultant, but I'm playing a bit of a marriage counselor role inside the
Yeah.
organization, right? Trying to get everyone to align on how that vision becomes achievable for them.
Well, and again, this seems like you're into this situation where governance and monitoring and the ability to have ongoing standards becomes like the challenge to implement them is raised because of this internal conflict that you're describing, but also the risk of not having them seems like you're experiencing the outcomes of it, right?
Yeah.
Which is all of this fragmentation and things that you think work that don't work, or they only work under certain circumstances, and it can be exhausting to try to even uncover where all the problems are, especially on something as broad as what you're describing.
Yeah, and then the other challenge there too, which is not uncommon, right? They're a big organization. They see themselves as equivalents to the NFL, right? That's who they're, and so it's hard for them to be told a little bit like, well, we can't go and do that, right? Like we've got a lot to, and so there's also that challenge of like the end goal maybe being a little too far away from the reality of the situation. And I think that as privacy professionals, market, anyone that's kind of on this webinar looking at these types of projects, setting realistic goals and like really like being honest about where we are as an organization before trying to say like, well, within the next year, we're actually going to do X, Y, and Z is really important because,
Yeah.
you put yourself in kind of a bad place internally, to be honest. So
Totally. Well, and I would think one of the biggest challenges here is, it's great to be aspirational, but then how do you build an actionable
exactly.
execution plan that allows them to experience success along the way and make real progress and sort of demonstrate the reduction in risk.
I like that actionable versus aspirational, Josh. I'm gonna be using that.
Excellent. Okay, so one thing that I did want to kind of get to, and I don't know if we're going to touch on it in this third one, was you were talking about some of the challenges around mobile as well, and I wanted to get your thoughts because it sounds like that's something that's coming up a lot with some of the clients that you're kind of wrestling with.
Yeah. So I don't think this case study goes over a mobile too much, and so for sake of time, can kind of put this to the side. Maybe talk a little bit about mobile, and so actually, we'll call it case study four. I don't have slides for it, but
Okay.
right now, we're doing a big mobile implementation, and this year, I would say we have had a big increase, and myself personally, almost all of the projects that I've been working on this year involve a mobile component, and with the
And to be
mobile
clear, when
side,
when we're talking mobile, we're talking like a compiled, downloaded on your phone app, not a mobile view of your website, right? Just
yes, although in a lot of the mobile apps, there's a lot of web view components that
of
come up,
course,
and
of
that does
course.
have to be managed with CMP items. And
Yes.
so the thing that gets really unique with the mobile applications is you're thinking about the actual native CMP functions, right? So the SDKs that are actually in the applications, things that you might have to block. But for 99% of applications, you're also going to be signing someone in. So we're going to be doing authenticated CMP items from the jump.
Mhm.
So do we connect this to the website? How do we pass these values through? And then we have to think about things like our sign up processes. Do we kick off to Auth0 in their web view? Do we kick out to any other web views on our website when someone goes to see the privacy policy or look at fees or anything, whatever that might be? Because those are all areas that we need to tie into our web CMP. And oftentimes, then this kind of broader initiative will tie into marketing consent and making sure that folks' account deletion process is tied into their consumer rights and those things. And so with these mobile projects, just because of the fact that almost every app forces login, it forces organizations to think about things more comprehensively all at once from the initial implementation, instead of taking this like unauthenticated web approach, because there's very few unauthenticated mobile apps that you download and you use in that state.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes
And
sense.
so would say that definitely find a lot of challenges in that space, but knowing you can always do it with the authenticated lens is nice, and it allows us to open up the playbooks there, right? To solicit discretionary consent for marketing, or using some of the data that we get from the mobile application to do email messaging or to prompt things. And so in some ways, even though it is more complex, it can be a little bit easier to solution than on the
No,
website.
that totally makes sense. And just for everyone who is attending here, I think we will be sending out Zach's slides, so you won't miss out on all of the case study three, even if we didn't didn't get time to go through all of it. The last question I wanted to ask you, Zach, this is super timely. I'm seeing this all the time. I actually have a demo later this afternoon on exactly this topic, which is it's a little bit broader than just consent, which is these CIPA lawsuits that are happening
Mm. Mm.
all over the place, right? Like there's many of them getting filed. Um, it's beyond just consent,
It
right?
is.
And so you can be completely nailing consent and still be at risk for these things Is that something that you guys are seeing? Is that something that you're still that you're actively doing work around? Obviously, you've got a slide for it, so
Yeah.
I'm guessing you do.
We
But
we are, Josh. Yeah. So I've had within the last month a handful of folks reach out regarding this. I mean, there's always a couple actions that need to happen. If you've gotten to the point of you're actually getting the lawsuit in hand and that type of trace letter, you are going to need to retain outside counsel, and you're probably going to need to start working on that process. From a technology perspective, the immediate actions for us are to perform a comprehensive audit. So I think that's aligns probably, Josh, to what you would think as well, and from your product, to make sure that we actually understand what caused this and why are they sending it. And um,
well,
generally, I mean,
and
generally we
and what
find
we
2 hours.
I
Oh,
was
sorry.
also going to say is just being able to not only understand the lay of the land, but then, in a lot of cases,
Depends.
respond with evidence that,
Well, and
okay, we're not doing this.
that was I don't want to say that this is happening in wide amounts, but I have run into a couple of these this year where I'm not sure if it was copy paste lawsuits or what exactly was going on, but the tracking technologies they were accusing of being on the pages were just straight up not even on the sites
Yeah.
sometimes. So it was like instantly you do the scan, you do the audit, and you're like, well, they don't even run Facebook. Like they don't have it on. So like, well, how are you? And so there's a lot of those that are that way. And then there's some where unfortunately, like we do identify gaps really quickly. And we're like, like you guys weren't running GPC for the past like however long. And so, and in those cases, right, it's good to know that though. And it's good to make the remediations. And so absolutely we were dealing with this. Absolutely need to audit the site as soon as it happens, and then kind of decide what needs to happen from there.
No, no, I appreciate the insights.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, I know we are basically at our time here. Any questions that we didn't get to, we will follow up with post webinar. We'll be sending around a link to the recording of this if you want to share it with any of your colleagues. We'll also be making the slides available that we've been sort of bouncing around throughout the conversation today. And I just, want to thank you on behalf of Vault, Zach, for joining us here. This was a great kickoff to the Leaders in Privacy series, and thank you so much for sharing your insights with all the attendees today. And I very much enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Josh. I had a great time. Thank you for hosting and having us here from Fuller. We look forward to watching the rest of the series as you guys release it.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.